The moment Clayton Finley rode into Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, in the autumn of 1884, he told himself he would stay only long enough to water his horse and buy a bag of cornmeal, and then he would ride on south, the way a man without roots always does. But the universe, it seemed, had grown tired of letting him have his way. Harlan Creek sat in a shallow valley between two rust-colored ridges, the kind of town that looked like it had been dropped there by accident and had simply never bothered to move. There was a general store, a livery stable, a two-room jail, a saloon that doubled as a barbershop on Sunday mornings, and a post office that shared its building with a dressmaker who had not had a customer in 3 weeks. Dust moved through the main street in slow, thoughtful spirals, as if the wind itself had nowhere particular to be. The whole place smelled of horse and dry sage, and the particular loneliness that clings to small western towns in October, when the summer visitors have gone, and the winter has not yet arrived to make the isolation feel purposeful. Clayton tied his roan mare, Ida, to the post outside the general store and stood for a moment in the afternoon light, feeling the travel in his bones. He was 31 years old, though he looked perhaps 35, with the kind of face that sun and silence carve over years of outdoor living. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and gray eyes that had a habit of resting on things a moment longer than politeness required, as if he were trying to memorize the world against some future when he might need to remember it. He carried himself with the particular economy of motion that belongs to men who have been alone a long time, every gesture quiet and contained, nothing wasted. He had not always been like this. There had been a time, 12 years back, when he had signed his name with a flourish, when the letters of Clayton Finley had seemed to him like something solid, something worth the ink. He had been 19 then, newly arrived in Texas with ambitions that still embarrassed him to recall, a young man with a good horse and better dreams. He had borrowed money from a man named Horatio Graves to start a cattle operation near Laredo, and he had shaken that man's hand and signed his name on a promissory note with the kind of confidence that only the very young and the very foolish can sustain. What had followed was a chain of catastrophes so complete and so thorough that Clayton had eventually concluded that the universe was trying to communicate something to him about the nature of pride. A drought in the first year had killed half his herd. A flash flood in the second had taken 3 of his remaining cattle, and his only hired hand, a kind old man named Devereux, who had drowned trying to save a calf that was not worth saving. Clayton had sold what remained, paid back what he could, and spent the following decade doing other men's work, mending fences, driving cattle, riding guard on freight wagons, taking whatever job kept his horse fed and put enough in his pocket for a meal and a bed when the weather turned hard. He had not failed dramatically enough to become a legend, and he had not succeeded enough to rebuild anything worth naming. He had simply become a man who moved from place to place, doing useful work for other men's ambitions, and in time he had stopped thinking of himself as a person who deserved a fixed address or a last name that meant anything. When he was required to write his name on a work ledger, on a receipt, on the occasional legal document, he did it quickly, with the tight minimal script of a man who does not want to draw attention to himself, the letters small and apologetic, as if even the ink was embarrassed. Clayton Finley. 2 words that had once felt like the beginning of something. Now they felt like the punctuation at the end. He pushed open the door of the general store and let the familiar smell of coffee and dried beans and leather wash over him. The store was dim and well organized, shelves stacked with canned goods and sacks of flour and coils of rope, a glass case near the counter displaying tobacco and small tools. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s with a white beard and spectacles on the end of his nose, who looked up from his ledger with the cautious welcome of a man who is glad for business but knows that strangers carry uncertainty along with their coin. "Afternoon," Clayton said. "Afternoon," the old man said. passing through. "That's the plan," Clayton said. "Need cornmeal if you have it, some dried beans, salt." "Got all three," the old man said, beginning to move along his shelves. "Name's Hector Prout. I run this store and most of the gossip in this town, in case you need either." Clayton allowed himself a small smile. "Clayton," he said. Just the one name, the way he usually offered it, as if the second part were something he hadn't quite decided to part with yet. He was examining a row of canned peaches and thinking about whether he could justify the expense when the door behind him opened and brought with it a gust of October air and the sound of boots on the wooden floor, quick and purposeful. He turned, and that was when he saw Matilda Atwood for the first time, and he would later think that if he had known in that moment what the next 6 months would do to him, he might have paid for his cornmeal and left before she reached the counter. He would later think this without meaning it. She was 26 years old, with dark red hair that she wore pinned up in a way that suggested she had done it herself quickly, without a mirror, because there were more important things to attend to. She was not a small woman. She stood at a height that met most men's eyes, and she moved with the directness of someone who has learned that the world does not make way unless you ask it to. She wore a practical brown dress and a canvas coat that was a half size too large for her, and she was carrying, with considerable effort, a wooden crate that contained what appeared to be 6 jars of preserved tomatoes, a bolt of blue fabric, and a hammer. "Mr. Prout," she said, setting the crate down on the counter with a thud that rattled the jars. "I need to speak with you about the price you quoted me for nails last week, because I have since spoken with Thomas Hale at the hardware over in Dempsey, and he tells me that quarter-inch cut nails ought not to cost more than 40 cents a pound, and you charged me 60, and I appreciate that Harlan Creek is not Dempsey. But I do not believe that the 20 miles between them accounts for a difference of that magnitude." Hector Prout had the expression of a man who has had this conversation before and respects it anyway. "Miss Atwood," he said, "I ordered those nails special because you said you needed them in a hurry, and there is a carrying cost associated with—" "The carrying cost," Matilda Atwood said, "does not amount to 20 cents a pound, Mr. Prout, and we both know it." She pulled a small leather notebook from her coat pocket and opened it to a page covered in neat columns of figures. "I have written it all out. The freight rate from Santa Fe to Dempsey is 12 cents per hundredweight per mile, which means that 20 additional miles adds approximately 2.5 cents per pound, not 20. I am happy to pay the 12 cents if you prefer that to 40. Hector Prout looked at the notebook, looked at Matilda Atwood, and had the wisdom to know when he was in the presence of someone who had done the arithmetic. 40 cents a pound it is, then, he said. "You'll want them on account." "Please," she said, and began writing in the notebook. Clayton had been standing by the canned peaches this entire time, and he was aware that he was staring, which was rude, and that he was not going to stop, which was a problem. There was something about the way she had handled that conversation, calm and precise, and without apology, that struck him as remarkable. He had known plenty of people who were confident in their opinions, but most of them announced their confidence loudly, as if volume were a form of evidence. She had simply laid out the numbers and waited, with the patience of a person who already knows the answer and is only giving you time to arrive at it yourself. She became aware of him then, glancing sideways, and he looked away too late to pretend he hadn't been watching. "I'm sorry," he said, because it was the honest thing. "I wasn't trying to be rude. I was just—" He stopped, uncertain how to finish that sentence without sounding foolish. She considered him for a moment with brown eyes that were direct without being unkind. "You were listening," she said. "It's all right. Most people who listen in this town do it sideways, behind their hands. You at least had the decency to do it from the front." "Clayton," he said, offering the name again, and then, because something about the directness of her gaze made the usual half-introduction seem like a lie, "Clayton Finley." "Matilda Atwood," she said, and shook his hand the way a man would, firmly, as if she saw no reason to do it any differently. He picked up his cornmeal and his beans and paid for them, and he told himself that he would walk out that door and ride south because that was the plan, and he was a man who kept to his plans because his plans were the only thing that gave his days any shape. He made it as far as the door. "Mr. Finley," Hector Prout said behind him, "you looking for work?" "Because I happen to know that Miss Atwood here is in need of a carpenter, and I can see from the state of your hands that you know your way around a hammer." Clayton turned. Matilda Atwood was looking at him with an expression that was not quite hope. She was too self-possessed for that, but was something adjacent to it, an openness, a willingness to hear what he might say. "I do know my way around a hammer," he said carefully. "What's the work?" "I am building a schoolhouse," Matilda Atwood said. "I have the land, I have the lumber coming from Dempsey next Thursday, and I have the approval of the town council such as it is. What I do not have is someone who can help me frame and raise it before the first hard freeze. The man I had engaged broke his wrist falling off a wagon 2 weeks ago." "A schoolhouse," Clayton said. "For the children of Harlan Creek and the surrounding farms," she said. "There are 23 children within riding distance who currently have no school. I came here 8 months ago to open one. I have been waiting on the lumber for 3 of those months and on the town council for the other 5. "Are you the teacher?" "I am," she said. "I taught in Missouri for 4 years before I came west. I hold a certificate from the state of Missouri, and I have 17 textbooks that have been sitting in crates in my back room for 6 months waiting for a building to live in." Clayton looked at her, then at the door, then back at her. "What does it pay?" he asked. $3 a day," she said, "and I will feed you noon dinner. I warn you that I am not a remarkable cook, but I am an adequate one." $3 a day was a fair wage for construction work in the territory in 1884, and Clayton knew it. He also knew that the only thing waiting for him south of Harlan Creek was more of the same road he had been on for 12 years, the same cycle of arriving and leaving, and the terrible familiar comfort of having no one to disappoint but himself. "I'll need to stable my horse," he said. "The livery is across the street," Matilda Atwood said. "Emilio Soto runs it and he is honest. Tell him I sent you and he will give you the fair rate." "When do I start?" "Thursday," she said, "when the lumber arrives. Until then, if you can manage a Sunday afternoon without employment, there is a boarding house run by Mrs. Farris on Crockett Street that has a vacancy." He started Thursday, but he did not spend the days before it simply waiting. On Tuesday morning he found himself at Emilio Soto's livery, where Ida was well settled in a clean stall, and he asked if there was any odd work to be done. Emilio, a Mexican man in his 40s with an easy smile, and the arms of someone who had spent his life managing large animals, set him to repairing 3 broken stall doors and rehanging a gate that had been dragging for months. They worked together in a companionable silence broken occasionally by conversation about horses and weather and the particular challenges of maintaining wood structures in the dry desert air. "You met Miss Atwood," Emilio said at one point. It was not a question. "I did," Clayton said. "She is something," Emilio said, without elaboration, driving a nail with a single clean stroke. "She is," Clayton agreed. On Wednesday, he walked the perimeter of the lot where the schoolhouse was to be built. She had shown him the deed and the survey stakes, and he spent the better part of the afternoon making calculations on a scrap of paper, measuring the distances between stakes, working out in his head how the framing should go, how the roof pitch ought to run to shed snow without requiring extraordinary bracing. He was good at this, had always been good at understanding how things should fit together, how weight distributes and where a structure needs to be strong. It was, he thought, perhaps the only useful thing that his years of miscellaneous labor had given him, a thorough practical understanding of how to build things that would stand. He did not see Matilda Atwood on Tuesday or Wednesday, but he thought about her more than he was comfortable with. He thought about the way she had opened her notebook without self-consciousness, the way her figures had been arranged in neat columns, the way she had said his name, Clayton Finley, when she wrote it down on a small card she kept for her records. She had said it the way people say words they trust, without rushing through them, as if both syllables deserved their space. He had not written his own name with any pride in 12 years, had not heard it spoken with anything other than the neutral utility of a word used to identify a person, rather than describe one. When Matilda Atwood said it, standing in Hector Prute's general store with her notebook open and her hair escaping its pins on the left side, she said it like it was worth something, like the name itself carried some weight she was willing to acknowledge, and he could not shake the feeling that followed, a warmth that started somewhere in his chest and spread outward, uncomfortable and welcome at the same time, like blood returning to a cold hand. He lay awake in Mrs. Ferris's boarding house that night and told himself that he was a man who had been foolish before and had the wreckage to prove it, and that he would do his job well and professionally, and then he would ride south when the work was finished. And none of this warmth in his chest was anything he needed to investigate further. He believed this with the conviction of a man who already knows he is wrong. The lumber arrived Thursday morning on a flatbed wagon from Dempsey, a load of pine boards and rough beams that smelled of resin and the mountains where they had been milled. The wagon driver, a laconic man named Perkins, helped unload and then departed, leaving Clayton and Matilda Atwood standing beside a substantial pile of raw material in the pale morning light. She was wearing work clothes, a plain dark skirt and heavy boots and a man's canvas jacket, and she had tied her hair back practically and rolled up her sleeves, and was looking at the pile of lumber with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and is now required to make it real. "All right," she said. "Where do we begin?" "Sill plates first," Clayton said. "We need to lay the foundation beam along each wall line and anchor it." "Did you arrange for the concrete footings?" She had. She had arranged for everything he would discover. She had spoken to a man named Garrett who had poured 4 concrete piers the previous week, which were now cured and ready, set at the corners of the lot with the precision of someone who had read the relevant instructions and followed them exactly. "You poured these yourself?" Clayton asked, crouching to examine one. "I supervised," she said. "Mr. Garrett poured them, but I mixed the proportions." "They're good," he said. "Level and sound." She accepted this with a brief nod, as if she had expected them to be good and was glad to have the confirmation but not surprised by it. They worked well together from the first day, which surprised Clayton more than he expected. He had worked with men who needed constant direction and men who presumed to know more than they did and men who worked fine on their own, but could not coordinate with anyone else. Matilda Atwood worked like someone who had decided that the job was what mattered, and that her part in it was to be as useful as possible without getting in the way of someone else's usefulness. She followed his lead on structural decisions because she recognized that he knew more about framing than she did, and he followed her lead on the dimensions and layout because she had the plans clear in her mind and knew exactly what the finished building needed to be. Between them, they had something that resembled, more than anything else, mutual respect, which Clayton had learned was rarer and more valuable than almost any other component of good working partnership. By the end of the first day, they had the sill plates in place and the beginning of the floor frame laid. By the end of the second day, the floor was complete and they had begun the wall framing. She brought noon dinner both days, the promised adequate cooking, which turned out to be cornbread and beans, and on the second day, a venison stew that was better than adequate, that was in fact quite good, with a depth of flavor that suggested she had spent more time on it than she was willing to admit. "This is good," he said, meaning the stew. "I said I was adequate," she said. "You were wrong," he said, and looked up from his bowl to find her watching him with the beginning of a smile. They talked while they worked, in the way that people talk when their hands are busy and their minds are partly occupied, and the remaining portion relaxed enough to be honest. She told him about Missouri, about the school where she had taught, about the reason she had come west. Her father had died and left her a small sum of money and no compelling reason to stay, and she had read an article in a newspaper about the shortage of teachers in the Western Territories, and she had thought, with the combination of idealism and practicality that seemed characteristic of her, that it was a problem she was equipped to address. She had written to 3 territorial boards of education, received 2 responses, chosen Harlan Creek because the description of the surrounding country appealed to her, and arrived in February of 1884 with her 17 textbooks, her teaching certificate, a trunk of practical clothing, and a plan. "Were you afraid?" Clayton asked, driving a 10-penny nail into a wall stud. "Of coming west," she said. "Not exactly afraid. I knew it would be difficult. I thought it would probably be less straightforwardly difficult than it turned out to be." "The town council," he said. "The town council," she confirmed. 3 of the 5 members had some objection to a woman being the teacher. Not on any grounds they could state clearly, which made it harder to address. One of them said he thought the children might not respect a woman's authority, which I took as an invitation to ask him how many classrooms he had managed. How did he respond? He did not respond. He changed the subject. And then 4 months later he voted to approve the schoolhouse, so perhaps he thought about it. Clayton smiled. "Did you always know you wanted to teach?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most questions. "I always knew I wanted to be useful," she said. "Teaching is the kind of useful that lasts. You fix a fence and in 10 years it needs fixing again. You teach a child to read and they carry it their whole life." He thought about this for a long time after she said it, driving nails and fitting studs, thinking about the various kinds of work he had done in the past 12 years and which of them had lasted. He thought about Devereux, who had drowned in a flood for a calf, and about Horatio Graves, who had given a 19-year-old a loan he probably couldn't afford and had been repaid eventually, fully and with interest, though it had taken 7 years. He thought about fences he had mended and cattle he had driven and freight he had guarded. Useful work, all of it, none of it lasting. "You ever think about doing something different?" he asked. "Something that stays?" She looked at him over the half-raised wall frame. "I am doing it," she said simply. The walls went up at the end of the first week, all 4 of them, rough pine studs standing in the October sun, smelling of the mountains and the future. It was the day they raised the front wall that the real work happened, the part that required genuine teamwork, 2 people walking a heavy frame upright from the ground, one on each side, pushing it vertical and holding it there while the other reached for the temporary brace. Clayton had done this before with 2 other men and found it strenuous. He did it with Matilda Atwood and found it something else entirely. She was strong genuinely, practically strong, not in a performed way but in the way of someone who had been using their body for real work for a long time. And when the front wall frame tilted upward and the full weight of it transferred into their hands, she held it without stumbling, her boots set firm in the dirt, her jaw set with concentration. He watched her hold the weight while he reached for the brace and nailed it in place, and he was aware of a feeling that was not quite admiration but contained admiration, the way a river contains water entirely, essentially in every part. "You can let it go," he said when the brace was set. She released the frame slowly, making sure, and then stepped back and looked at the standing wall with an expression that he would have called joy if he had trusted himself to name another person's emotions. It was open and unguarded, that expression, and it lasted only a few seconds before she composed herself and pulled her notebook from her pocket to record the progress, but he had seen it, and he put it somewhere safe, the way you store a thing of value. "1 down," she said. 3 to go, he said. They raised all 4 walls that day, working until the light failed, and when they were done they stood in the middle of what would be the schoolroom floor, 4 walls around them and the Nevada stars overhead. The roof would come next week, and there was a moment of shared silence that felt like a kind of ceremony. "Mr. Finley," she said into the quiet. "Clayton," he said. He didn't know why he said it. He just wanted his given name in her mouth again. She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't fully read in the dark. "Clayton," she said, "thank you for the work today. I could not have done this alone." "You would have found a way," he said. "You find ways." "I do," she agreed. But I'm glad I didn't have to find this one alone. They walked back toward town in the failing light, and he was sharply aware of how much he did not want to part ways at the end of the street, where her path went left toward her small rented house, and his went right toward Mrs. Ferris's boarding house. He was aware that this wanting was the beginning of something he had not planned for, something that did not fit into the picture of a man who stays only as long as the work lasts and then rides on. He rode on the South Road on Sunday morning, just to see what it felt like. He got 2 miles out of town and stopped and sat on Ida in the middle of the road and looked at the landscape around him, the flat scrubland going orange and gold with autumn, the distant blue ridges, the sky, that enormous New Mexico sky going pale at the edges, and he thought about Matilda Atwood standing in the middle of an open room frame with the stars above her and the walls around her, and saying his name like it was worth something. He turned Ida around and rode back to Harlan Creek. He told himself it was because the roof was not finished, and he had given his word. The roof took 4 days, and during those 4 days something shifted between them in a way that was gradual and then suddenly undeniable, the way weather changes. They talked more easily. She brought better and better food for noon dinner. She had clearly abandoned the pretense of adequacy, and he began to notice small things, the way her hands moved when she explained something, precise and expressive at once, the way she laughed, which she did not do often, but when she did it was a full and generous sound that she made no attempt to restrain. She asked him questions about himself that were not prying but were genuine, and he answered them more fully than he usually answered such questions, because something about her directness made deflection feel rude rather than merely private. She knew about the cattle venture by the end of the 2nd week. He had told her about it one afternoon while they were working on the roof, fitting pine boards across the rafters, talking as they worked, and he had told her about the promissory note and the drought and the flood in Devereux and the long aftermath. He told it without drama or self-pity, the way he had learned to understand it himself, as a series of events that had happened and could not be unhappened. "You paid it back," she said when he had finished. "Took 7 years," he said. "You paid it back," she said again, as if this were the important fact, the one that superseded the others. "All of it. With interest," he said. "Graves was decent about it. He didn't have to wait." "The fact that he was patient doesn't diminish that you were honest," she said. "A lot of men in that position would have disappeared." He was quiet for a moment, fitting the next board. "I thought about it," he said, which was the truth. "But you didn't," she said. "That is the relevant fact, Clayton. That is the one that says something about you." He had heard it again, his name, both parts, spoken with the same uncomplicated weight. He looked up at her across the sloping roof surface and found her looking back at him with those direct brown eyes, and there was no pretending to himself about what was happening to him. He was falling for this woman with the methodical completeness of a tree that has been cut through at the base, slowly, and then all at once. He said nothing, because he did not trust himself with words just then, and they went back to work, and the roof went on, and by the end of the week the schoolhouse was enclosed. There were still interior details to manage, windows to frame and set, a door to hang, a floor to finish, shelves along the back wall for the books, and Clayton found reasons to extend the work, not dishonestly, because all of these things genuinely needed doing, but with a thoroughness that he might not have brought to a job he was eager to finish. He took care with the window frames. He planed the door until it fit its frame perfectly. He built the bookshelves with a precision that was, honestly, beyond what a schoolhouse required but felt appropriate. On the Thursday of the 3rd week, Matilda Atwood brought the 17 textbooks from their crates in her back room and spent the afternoon arranging them on the shelves, while Clayton finished the floor near the front door. The afternoon light came through the new windows at a low angle, and it lit the room with a warmth that made everything in it look settled and permanent. She moved along the shelves carefully, reading the spines, placing each book with the deliberateness of someone unpacking something sacred. "You brought McGuffey's Readers," he said. She turned. You know them. I learned to read from them, he said. Third reader, I had a teacher in Arkansas. Her name was Mrs. Carmody. She was a small woman with big opinions about punctuation. Matilda Atwood laughed the full, unguarded laugh and held up a copy of the third reader. Then you and I had the same starting point, she said. Mrs. Carmody sounds like someone I would have liked. She would have liked you, he said, and meant it. She set the book on the shelf and looked at him. Your education matters to you, she said. I can tell from the way you talk, you read. When I can find books, he said, traveling light limits it. She went to one of the shelves and took down a book. He could see from across the room that it was a thin volume, some kind of poetry, and crossed to where he was working and set it beside his tools. You can borrow this, she said. It will survive being in a saddlebag if you wrap it. He looked at it. Longfellow. I haven't read Longfellow, he said. You'll like it, she said. He writes about the sea, but the feeling is universal. Loss and motion, and the sense that somewhere there is a destination, even when you cannot see it. He looked up at her standing over him in the afternoon light, the room warm and smelling of pine and new wood around them, and he thought that in 12 years of moving from place to place he had never arrived anywhere that felt like a destination, and that this was the closest thing. I may be a while returning it, he said. I know where you are, she said, and went back to her books. He lay awake that night thinking about what she meant by that, and whether she meant it the way he hoped she meant it. The following Saturday was the day the schoolhouse was, for all practical purposes, complete. The interior was finished, the books were shelved, the windows were set and glazed. He had ridden to Dempsey for the glass himself, and the door swung true on its new hardware. They had hung a small bell above the door, a proper school bell that Matilda Atwood had ordered from a catalog 3 months earlier and which had arrived, serendipitously, the previous week. Clayton had hung it and tested it, and the sound it made was clear and bright and carried a long way in the thin desert air. They were standing outside the finished schoolhouse. It was clean white pine in the sunlight, the bell shining above the door, the front step solid and level, every joint made well, and Matilda Atwood was looking at it with an expression that he recognized now, the joy she did not quite allow herself to show for long. He watched her let herself have a full minute of it, looking at the building that had not existed a month ago and now stood here solid and permanent and ready for children. Then she turned to him and said, I don't know how to thank you adequately. The work was enough, he said, and the cooking, she smiled at that. The cooking I enjoyed. I always cook better when there's someone to cook for. A silence settled between them, the kind that has weight. He was aware that the work was done and that he had no remaining reason, no professional reason, the only kind he had been permitting himself to stay. South was still south. The road was still there. What will you do now? She asked, which was the question he had been dreading and expecting. I don't know, he said, which was the most honest answer he had given to that question in years. She looked at him steadily. I hope you stay, she said, not for professional reasons. I have no more building work to offer you. I hope you stay because, she paused, and he could see that she was being precise with herself, that she was choosing words the way she chose numbers for accuracy. Because I would like to know you better, Clayton Finley, and I am not accustomed to hoping for things I have not stated plainly. He was quiet for a moment. The bell above the door moved slightly in the wind and made a small, soft sound, like a single clear note before a piece of music begins. I'm not accustomed to being asked to stay, he said. Does it suit you? She said, being asked. It does, he said, very much. She held his gaze for a moment with those brown eyes, and then she nodded once, as if something had been decided and filed away in the correct column, and she went back inside to see about the books. And Clayton Finley stood in the sunlight outside the schoolhouse he had helped build and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that he could only identify by its unfamiliarity. It felt like possibility. He stayed. He found work at the livery, helping Emilio Soto through the busy season when the freighters were making their last runs before winter closed the mountain roads. It was good work, physical and regular, and Emilio was a good man to work for, fair, humorous, and deeply knowledgeable about horses, in a way that Clayton respected and learned from. He stayed at Mrs. Ferris's boarding house, which was plain and clean and run with an iron hand by the widowed Mrs. Ferris, who had opinions about meals and curfews and the moral responsibility of men to wipe their boots before entering. The schoolhouse opened on the first Monday of November, with 16 children in attendance. The other 7 lived too far out to come daily, but would come when their families could manage it. Clayton was not present for the opening, but Matilda Atwood told him about it that evening when he came to her house. She had taken to cooking dinner for both of them twice a week, on Tuesday and Friday, an arrangement that had begun with the stated purpose of economy, but that both of them understood was something else. And her description of the 16 children filing in and finding their seats, and looking at the shelves of books with a combination of awe and suspicion made him laugh and made her glow. One of them, she said, a boy named Samuel Ortega, about 9 years old, went directly to the bookshelf before I had said a word and pulled out a book and held it like he was afraid I might take it back. He's been wanting this. His mother rode 12 miles last spring to petition the town council for the school. What did you give him? Clayton asked. The third reader, she said. I thought you might approve. He looked at her across the kitchen table, candlelight warm between them, and thought about Mrs. Carmody and a boy in Arkansas who had held a book the same way, afraid it might be taken back. I do, he said. November turned cold, the kind of dry desert cold that arrives suddenly and without apology. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold and were now bare. The nights dropped below freezing. Clayton bought a better coat, a proper line duster, and wore it against the wind that came off the ridges with no obstacles to slow it. Ida, moved to a covered stall, seemed content enough. The town settled into its winter rhythms, slower and quieter, the way places do when the season closes around them. He and Matilda Atwood walked together on Saturday afternoons, when she had finished her school preparation for the following week, and he had finished his work at the livery. They walked the perimeter of town and sometimes out along the creek, talking about everything and nothing. About her students, about the books she was reading, about history and philosophy, and the mechanics of the windmill east of town that had needed a new gear last week, and which Clayton had helped Emilio repair, about the proper method of preserving peaches, about whether there was any real difference between faith and stubbornness. She had strong opinions about most things and held them without rigidity, willing to change her view when given sufficient reason, and he found this combination, confidence and openness, remarkable in a way he could not quite put into words but kept trying to. One Saturday in late November, they walked out to the creek and stood watching the water, which was low at this season, moving slowly between ice-edged banks. The sky was the particular winter blue of high desert country, so clear and deep it seemed almost solid. She was standing close enough that the canvas of her coat sleeve touched his. What was the best place you ever stopped? She asked. She asked questions like this, sudden and specific, requiring thought. He considered it seriously, the way she would want him to. There was a place in Colorado, he said, a ranch outside of Trinidad. I spent 6 months there, one winter and the spring. The mountains were extraordinary. I would look at them every morning and feel. He stopped, trying to find the right word. Large, she offered. Small, he said, but in a way that felt good, the right kind of small. She turned to look at him. I understand that, she said. New Mexico does it to me. The sky does. Most people find it unsettling, the scale of it. It does not unsettle me. No, he said, I wouldn't think it would. She was looking at him with an expression he had been cataloging over the past weeks, a look of considered attention, as if he were a text she was reading carefully. He met it and held it, and the wind moved around them and the creek made its quiet sounds. Clayton, she said. Yes, he said. I am going to say something directly because I do not know another way to say it that would not be dishonest, she said. I care for you. I have been aware of it for some weeks, and I have been thinking carefully about whether to say it, not because I am uncertain of the feeling, but because I wanted to be certain it was something I ought to say. I believe it is. He looked at her for a long moment. the blue sky above them, the bare cottonwoods, the frozen creek edge, and he thought about a man who had not written his own name with pride in 12 years, who had been moving from place to place with the careful minimalism of someone who has stopped expecting anything particular from the world. He thought about what it meant to be told, plainly and precisely, by a person he had come to respect more than almost anyone he had ever known, that he was worth caring for. "I care for you," he said. "I have been trying not to say it because I was not sure I had any right to." She frowned slightly, not in displeasure but in the way she frowned when a piece of reasoning didn't hold up. "On what grounds would you not have the right?" she said. "On the grounds that I don't have much to offer," he said. "I'm a man who works for wages and sleeps in other people's houses and owns a horse and a saddle and a book of Longfellow that I borrowed and haven't returned." "You built me a schoolhouse," she said. "You built the schoolhouse," he said. "I helped." "Clayton." She said his name with a particular sharpness, the way she said numbers when someone was about to make an arithmetic error. "I am not asking you to offer me anything. I am telling you that I care for you. The accounting you are doing is not relevant to what I have said." He looked at her standing there in the winter light, her hair coming loose on the left side the way it always did, her brown eyes steady and sensible and full of something that was entirely for him. And he thought that the universe, which had seemed for many years to be communicating something grim, might have been trying to say something else all along, that the long road south and the succession of other men's fences, and the 12 years of writing his name like an apology had been leading, with the indirection of things that have no patience for shortcuts, to this creek bank, this woman, this moment. "I care for you very much," he said, which was less than what he felt but was as close as he could get to it with language. "I would like the chance to keep doing so if you'll allow it." "I will allow it," she said, which was her way of saying yes, and it was perfect. She let him take her hand, and they stood by the creek for a while longer, and the wind was cold and the sky was very blue, and everything felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it had landed in exactly the right place. Winter in Harlan Creek moved slowly and deliberately, the way winters do in country where the cold is serious but not killing, a cold that asks you to be sensible rather than heroic. Clayton continued at the livery and took on additional work when it came. He repaired the roof of the general store after a heavy snow in December, and he helped build a new addition to the Soto family's home when Emilio's wife, Rosa, announced that they needed an additional room before spring. Rosa Sode was a warm and talkative woman who fed Clayton lunch whenever he was working on the addition, and who regarded the developing situation between him and Matilda Atwood with open and enthusiastic approval. "She is a good woman," Rosa told Clayton one afternoon, setting a plate of tamales in front of him with the authority of someone delivering a verdict. "She is the best thing that has happened to this town since we put in the well. You should not be slow about it." "About what?" Clayton said. Rosa looked at him with the expression of a woman who has infinite patience for human obtuseness and none at all for deliberate innocence. "About the thing you are not saying," she said. He took a tamale and thought about this. Christmas came and went with the small ceremonies of a frontier town. A service in the community hall that doubled as a church, a modest dinner at Mrs. Farris's for the boarders, gifts exchanged between people who had become, over the course of the year, something like a community. Clayton gave Matilda a book he had found in the back of Hector Prute's store, a natural history of the American Southwest with detailed illustrations of the desert plants and animals, because she had mentioned once that she wanted her students to learn about the land they lived on. She received it with exactly the response he had hoped for: genuine delight, first at the subject, then at the illustrations, then at the fact that he had been paying attention to what she said. She gave him a pair of riding gloves, lined with wool, stitched carefully with the kind of even, precise stitching that characterized everything she did. They were the most useful and most personal gift he had received in longer than he could accurately remember. He wore them every day and thought of her every time he put them on. In January, she invited him to the schoolhouse on a Friday afternoon, the last period of the week, to observe the class. He sat at the back of the room and watched her teach 14 children. The winter weather had kept 2 of the farther students home for 1 hour, and what he saw confirmed every half-formed thought he had been having about her for the past 3 months. She moved through the room with total authority that was not at all intimidating, a kind of cheerful certainty that learning was possible, and that every child in the room was capable of it given the right encouragement and the right material. She was funny, in the classroom dryly, warmly funny, and the children responded to it, visibly relaxed in a way that classroom children often are not. Samuel Ortega, the boy who had gone straight to the bookshelf on the first day, was reading the 4th reader now and occasionally showed signs of impatience with the pace of his classmates, which Matilda Atwood managed by giving him additional problems that kept him quietly engaged without making the other children feel slow. After the children had filed out into the cold afternoon, boots clattering on the front step, she found him still sitting at the back of the room and looked at him with a mild, inquiring expression. "Well," she said. "You're extraordinary at this," he said. She accepted this with a small smile. "I love it," she said. "It's hard to be bad at something you love if you also work at it. You've thought about what to do with Samuel," he said. "The additional problems." "I thought about it the first day," she said. "He's going to need something beyond what I can give him here in a few years. I've written to a school in Albuquerque about their program for advanced students. His family has no money, but there are scholarship arrangements, and I intend to pursue them." He looked at her across the clean-floored schoolroom with the December light coming through the windows and the books on the shelves, and thought that this was what she had meant, the day they framed the walls, when she had said she wanted to do something that lasted. Samuel Ortega would carry this for the rest of his life, the books and the problems and the woman who had written to Albuquerque on his behalf. And this was only the first year. "Matilda," he said, because he had been working up to something for several weeks and Rosa Soto had told him he was being slow, and Rosa Soto was right. She looked at him. "I came to Harlan Creek in October with the intention of buying cornmeal and leaving," he said. "I would like to tell you that I had some grander design, but the truth is I was just moving, the way I had been moving for 12 years, which is its own way of being lost without ever having to admit it. And then I met you." He stopped, gathered himself, continued. "I don't have much. I have my horse and my tools and a reasonable skill set, and a first name that sounds better coming out of your mouth than it ever did coming out of mine. But I am asking you if you would be willing to let this be something permanent. I am asking if you would consider marrying me, and I am asking with the full understanding that the question is presumptuous and that you have every right to tell me so." She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual because he had become, over the past months, tolerably good at reading her expressions. Then she said, "You said your name sounds better coming out of my mouth." "It does," he said. "Clayton Finley," she said deliberately, each syllable attended to. "Yes," he said. "I find the name entirely appropriate for the man who holds it," she said. "I have thought so since the first time I wrote it down. And I will marry you, Clayton. Yes," he exhaled, which he had apparently been forgetting to do. He crossed the room to her, and she looked up at him with those steady brown eyes, and he took her hands in his. The wool-lined gloves were on a hook by the door. She had been wearing them too, and from school in the cold, and her hands were warm and direct, like everything else about her. "I should like it very much," he said, "if the next thing I built in this town were a house." "I was thinking the same thing," she said. "I know a plot of land." Of course she did. They were married in March of 1885, when the desert was beginning its tentative spring, the first brittle bush flowering yellow on the hillsides, and the mornings losing their killing edge. The ceremony was held in the community hall, performed by a circuit preacher named Father Donnelly, who passed through Harlan Creek every 6 weeks, and who had conducted perhaps 300 frontier weddings, and radiated the particular warmth of a man who has witnessed enough human hope to believe in it unconstitutionally. The whole town came. Harlan Creek was not a large place, but it had, by March of 1885, become a community in the way that small western towns sometimes do, knit together by shared difficulty and shared weather and the knowledge that they were all, in some sense, in this remote and beautiful place together. Hector Prout came and brought a jar of good honey. The Soto family came with their children, Rosa wearing a red dress that was the finest thing anyone in Harlan Creek owned. Mrs. Ferris came and cried at the ceremony, which surprised everyone including Mrs. Ferris. Samuel Ortega came with his mother, Maria, who brought tamales and who embraced Matilda Atwood afterward with the fervor of a woman paying a debt that has no monetary equivalent. Matilda wore a dress of the blue fabric she had had in the crate the day Clayton first saw her in the general store, which she had evidently been saving. She had made it herself, over the winter, on a sewing machine she borrowed from Mrs. Ferris. It was simple and well cut, and in it she looked like herself, no more or less than that, and that was exactly right. Clayton wore his good shirt and his new coat and had managed, for the occasion, to get his hair cut and his boots polished, and when he wrote his name in the register that Father Donnelly set before him, he wrote it with the pen held steady and the letters formed with care, each one claiming its full space on the page. Clayton Finley. Both words. He looked at them there on the line and felt something settle in his chest, a click of recognition, as if the name had been waiting all along to be written this way. He did not say this to anyone except Matilda later when they were walking home through the early spring evening, the stars enormous overhead and the smell of desert flowers just beginning. "I wrote my name in the register today," he said, "and it felt different." She looked up at him, her hand in his. "Different how?" "Like it belonged to someone," he said. "Someone with a reason to write clearly." She stopped walking, turned to face him in the starlight, and reached up to touch his face briefly with one hand, a gesture so simple and so precise that it arrived somewhere past language. "It has always belonged to someone," she said. "You only had trouble seeing it." He covered her hand with his, held it a moment, let the desert night settle around them. "I am seeing it now," he said. The plot she had known about, of course she had, was a quarter-acre on the north edge of town, near enough to the schoolhouse to walk in any weather but far enough from the main street to have quiet. The soil was sandy and dry, as all the Harlan Creek soil was, but there were 2 established cottonwoods in the corner that would provide summer shade, and the view to the east took in the full face of the ridge, which at sunrise turned every shade of amber and rose imaginable. Clayton broke ground in April, after the last freeze. He had done construction work before, but he had never built something entirely for himself, entirely his own, and the experience was different from any other building project he had worked on in a way he had not anticipated. Every decision, where the windows faced, how wide the kitchen doorway was, whether the front porch would be large enough for 2 chairs, felt like a declaration of intent, a statement about who he was and what he intended his life to contain. He found he had strong opinions about these things, opinions he hadn't known he possessed. Emilio helped him on weekends. So did several other men from town, in the informal way of frontier communities where building is a communal activity, because everyone understands that the favor circulates. They raised the frame on a Saturday in April with half the town present, a genuine raising, neighbors holding ropes and pushing poles and calling instructions across the noise of hammers and lumber. And afterward Rosa sewed, and Maria Ortega and Mrs. Ferris, and several other women produced an extraordinary quantity of food from nowhere in particular, and everyone sat in the new framed shade and ate and talked until the sun was low. Matilda taught school through all of it, every weekday, 5 hours with the children, and on evenings and weekends she was at the building site with her notebook and her opinions, and frequently her tools. She was good with a plane, he discovered. She had an excellent eye for level and a steady hand, and he put her to work on the window frames because precision mattered there, and she was better at it than anyone else available. She accepted the assignment without comment and produced perfect results. The house was finished in June. It was not large, 4 rooms, a kitchen with a proper stove, 2 bedrooms, a sitting room with bookshelves along one entire wall, which had been Matilda's sole non-negotiable requirement. But it was sound and well-made, and it sat on its lot with the kind of settled rightness that good buildings have when they have been made with attention. The front porch held 2 chairs, and the view to the east at sunrise was everything they had hoped. They planted a kitchen garden in July and discovered together that neither of them was a natural gardener, but that with stubbornness and consulting Emilio's wife Rosa, who had been gardening in the high desert for 20 years, they could grow tomatoes and beans and enough squash to make them tired of squash by September. The summer passed in the rhythms of a life that had become, with astonishing speed, as familiar as if it had always existed. Clayton continued at the livery and took carpentry work as it came, which it did more frequently as the town grew. 2 new families arrived in June, and another in August, and the general process of growth that was happening across the territory was arriving, slowly and certainly, even to Harlan Creek. He repaired the saloon's back wall. He built a counter for the dressmaker who had finally gotten customers again. He framed an addition on the school, because the enrollment had grown to 22 students and would be larger in the fall. He was good at what he did, and people in Harlan Creek knew it, and he was learning to receive their respect without the old reflex of deflection, the instinct to minimize, to make himself smaller than the space he occupied. It was Matilda, mostly, who taught him this, not by instruction but by example. She received praise for her teaching with simple acknowledgement, neither false modesty nor inflated self-regard, just the clean truth of someone who knows the quality of their own work. He watched her and tried to learn the gesture. One August evening they were sitting on the front porch in their 2 chairs, the sun down behind the western ridge and the sky still pale at the edges, the air finally cooling after the brutal heat of the day, and Matilda set down the papers she had been marking and said, without preamble, "I believe I am pregnant." He looked at her. She was looking at the ridge with the expression of someone doing a calculation, precise and inward. "Are you certain?" he said. "I have been fairly certain for 3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be very certain before saying so." He was quiet for a moment, taking this in, the scale of it, the complete transformation of the future that a single sentence could contain. Then he reached across and took her hand where it lay on the arm of the chair, and she turned to look at him. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered this seriously. "I feel well," she said. "Physically, in the mornings I am somewhat less than well, but that is apparently standard. In general, I feel," she looked for the word with the same care she brought to everything. "Right," she said. "I feel that this is right." "Yes," he said. He could not have said it better. Their son was born in March of 1886, in the middle of the night, delivered by a woman named Agnes Halloway, who served as the nearest thing Harlan Creek had to a doctor, and who had, over the years, developed considerable expertise in the practical business of bringing children into the world. He was a healthy boy with a round, surprised-looking face and a significant amount of dark hair, and when Clayton held him for the first time, this small and impossibly complete person, warm and faintly bewildered, blinking at the lamplit room, he thought that whatever chain of events had led from a failed cattle operation in Laredo to this moment had, despite all evidence to the contrary, been heading somewhere good all along. They named him James, after no one in particular, but with the sense that it was a solid and unpretentious name for a person who had not yet had the opportunity to become anything but was clearly going to. James Finley. The name went in the Bible that Mrs. Farris gave them as a birth gift, written in the family record at the front, and Clayton wrote it there himself in the clear, careful hand he had been practicing for 2 years, and below it wrote his own name as the father, Clayton Finley, and then Matilda's as the mother and the date, and looked at the 3 names on the page and thought that this, specifically this, was the opposite of the fading into nothing he had been doing for 12 years. This was the opposite of traveling light. Samuel Ortega, now 11 and reading at a level that impressed the catalog school in Albuquerque, stopped at the house the following day to look at the baby and to present, very formally, a small wooden toy horse that he had carved himself. It was lopsided and clearly handmade, and it was given with a gravity that made it the most dignified gift James received. Matilda thanked Samuel with the seriousness the gift deserved, and Clayton noticed that Samuel stood a little straighter when she did. Life in Harlan Creek continued with the movement and variety of a growing frontier town in the latter years of the century. In the summer of 1886, a disagreement between two ranchers to the northwest of town over water rights came to a head in a way that involved the sheriff's office, considerable heated argument, and ultimately a formal legal settlement that required the services of a land attorney who rode up from Las Cruces. Clayton was involved peripherally because one of the ranchers had hired him to repair a fence along the disputed boundary, and he found himself, unexpectedly, serving as a witness to the circumstances of the fence's location, which turned out to be relevant to the legal question. He testified clearly and factually to what he had seen, and his account was credited because everyone in the territory who knew him agreed that Clayton Finley was a straight-talking man who did not embellish. He received a modest fee for the testimony and told Matilda about it that evening over dinner, and she said, "Of course they credited your account. You have a known reputation for honesty." "I do," he said. She gave him the look she reserved for arithmetic errors. "Clayton," she said, "you have lived in this town for 2 years, and in that time you have never overcharged for work, never failed to complete something you agreed to complete, returned correct change to Hector Prout when Hector gave you too much by mistake, and told the Alvarez family honestly that their roof needed complete replacement when you could have patched it and been paid for the patch and let it fail next season. Yes, you have a reputation for honesty." James, 8 months old at this point, was sitting on a blanket on the kitchen floor regarding a wooden spoon with deep philosophical concentration, and did not contribute to the conversation, but seemed to be listening. "I hadn't thought about it," Clayton said. "I know," she said. "That is part of what makes it genuine." In September of 1886, a letter arrived from Missouri, addressed to Matilda in an unfamiliar hand. It was from a woman named Eleanor Holt, who had been a fellow teacher in Missouri, and who was writing to ask if there might be any teaching positions in or near Harlan Creek, as she was considering coming west. Matilda consulted with the town council, wrote back with information about the expanding school and the possibility of a second teacher being needed in another year, and continued corresponding with Eleanor through the autumn. This correspondence would eventually, 2 years later, result in Eleanor Holt arriving in Harlan Creek and taking the teaching position that was created when the school's enrollment reached 30 students and Matilda could no longer manage the full range of grades alone. But that was in the future. In October of 1886, exactly 1 year after Clayton had first ridden into Harlan Creek, he and Matilda stood on the front porch in the early morning with James on Clayton's hip and coffee in their hands and watched the sun rise over the eastern ridge, which was doing its autumn thing with the light, all amber and deep rose. "1 year," Matilda said. "1 year since I bought cornmeal and beans," he said. She leaned against him, looking at the ridge. "I have been thinking about your cattle operation," she said. "The original one in Laredo, the thing you attempted when you were 19. He looked down at her. "What about it?" "I have been thinking that it was perhaps not as catastrophic a foundation as you have always believed," she said. "You attempted something substantial at 19. You were undone by circumstances that were not primarily your fault. You spent 7 years paying back a debt you could have avoided, and you developed in the process skills in construction and carpentry and livestock management that have served this community considerably. That is a story about a person who learns things from difficulty rather than being destroyed by them." He was quiet, looking at the ridge. James reached for his coffee cup and he moved it gently out of reach, and James regarded this with the philosophical acceptance of an infant who has learned that the world has rules. "You are arguing for the defense," he said. "I am presenting an accurate account," she said. "You have been presenting an account biased toward the prosecution for 12 years. I am correcting the record." He thought about the promissory note and Devereux and the flood and the long years of other men's fences. And then he thought about a schoolhouse frame going up in the October light and a woman with a notebook and a steady hand who had said his name like it meant something. He thought about the way she had said it, both parts, Clayton Finley, with equal weight given to each syllable as if both were deserved. "All right," he said. "Maybe the record needed correcting." "It did," she said. "You are a good man, Clayton. You were a good man at 19 with bad luck and too little experience. The two things are not the same, and you have been treating them as if they were for longer than is accurate." He put his arm around her, there on the porch, the baby on his hip and the coffee cooling in the October air and the light doing extraordinary things to the ridge. And he thought that this was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him, not the words of reassurance, which he had heard occasionally and discarded, but the evidence. The patient accumulation of evidence, over a year of Tuesday and Friday dinners and Saturday afternoon walks and long days working side by side, that he was the kind of person she thought he was. He had not been able to argue his way out of a thing supported by that much evidence. "Thank you," he said, which was not adequate, but she understood it. "You're welcome," she said, which was adequate for both of them. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was the harshest in memory for that part of New Mexico Territory. Cold that arrived in November and did not relent. Snow that came twice in December when Harlan Creek almost never saw snow. A January that froze the creek solid for 3 weeks. The town managed it with the practical solidarity of people who know that isolation in hard weather requires mutual aid, and Clayton found himself at the center of much of this, because he was good with his hands and had the tools and the knowledge, and increasingly, the disposition of a man who belongs somewhere and acts accordingly. He checked on the older residents during the cold snaps. He helped fortify the schoolhouse against the worst of the drafts, adding an additional layer of insulation to the north wall and reinforcing the roof over the winter break. He ran freight from the general store to the Ortega family, who were 12 miles out and could not make the trip in the worst weather. And while he was there, he fixed a door that had been warping in the cold and repaired the Ortega fireplace flue, which had developed a dangerous crack. Maria Ortega, Samuel's mother, watched him work on the flue with the thoughtful expression she wore when she was deciding something, and when he was done she said, "You are a different person from the man who came here in October last year." He paused, surprised. "You saw me in October last year." "Briefly," she said. "When I came into town for supplies, you were tying your horse outside the general store. You had the look of a man who does not expect to be in one place for long." He thought about this. "I didn't," he said. "No," she said, "and now you do not have that look. Samuel said when he was very small about some dogs they had that a dog that has never had a home looks different from a dog that has, in the eyes." He did not know what to say to this, so he said, "Samuel is a perceptive boy." "He is," she said. "Miss Atwood, Mrs. Finley, has done something remarkable for him. She writes to Albuquerque still." "I know," he said. "She is thorough." "She is," Maria said, "as are you. This family is fortunate to have you both in it." He rode back to Harlan Creek in the cold with the horse's breath smoking in the air and the desert blue-white with frost and the word fortunate echoing in his mind, and he thought that this was perhaps the most accurate word anyone had applied to him in 12 years. He was fortunate. He knew it. He intended to continue deserving to be. Spring came slowly, the way it does after a hard winter, as if the world needed time to believe in it. The creek thawed. The brittle bush came back. The children returned to the school in full numbers, and Matilda reported that despite the disruptions of the winter, the academic progress had been sustained. She had sent work home with families when she could, and had managed 3 sessions at the Ortega farm and 2 at the Gauthier farm during the worst weeks, driving out herself in the sleigh Emilio Soto lent her. Because she was, as Clayton had always known, not the kind of person who lets a hard winter interrupt something important. The spring of 1887 also brought a development that Clayton had been considering for some months, an opportunity to purchase the livery stable. Emilio Soto's brother in Albuquerque had been ill, and Emilio had decided, after much deliberation and with visible difficulty, that he needed to move his family to Albuquerque to help. He offered Clayton the livery at a fair price, knowing from 2 years of working together that Clayton would run it well and honestly. Clayton thought about it for a week. He thought about the promissory note in Laredo and the cattle that died in the drought and the 7 years of paying it back. He thought about what it meant to own something again, to put his name on something that belonged to him. He thought about Matilda, who would of course be part of this decision, and talked it through with her one evening after James was asleep, the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and her notebook open, and the figures laid out on both sides. "The price is reasonable," she said, looking at the numbers. "The income is stable. The horses always need to be somewhere in a town that's growing. The question is whether you want to be in one place indefinitely." "I want to be in this place indefinitely," he said. "I want to put my name on a business in this town and run it well and have people know that it is reliable because I run it." She looked up from the notebook. "Then that is what you should do," she said. "You're certain," he said. "Clayton," she said, "I was certain when you asked me to marry you that you were a man who builds things that last. I have had 2 years since then to confirm the hypothesis. Yes, I am certain." He went to Emilio the following morning and they shook hands, and the month of May saw the completion of the paperwork and the transfer of ownership. Clayton Finley's livery, the sign said, a sign he painted himself with careful letters, each one given its proper space on the board. He hung it on a Thursday morning and stood back and looked at it and felt something so large and so specific that he could not name it, but that Matilda, who was standing beside him, seemed to understand without requiring a name. "There," she said, and that was enough. He ran the livery with the same straightforward competence that characterized everything he put his hands to. He hired one man in the summer, a young Navajo man named Thomas Runningwaiter, who was 18 years old, had grown up around horses, and had the misfortune of existing in a territory where the prejudices against native people were frequently and casually enacted. Clayton hired him because he was the best person for the work, and when there was initially some grumbling in the town about it, Clayton addressed it with the same patient clarity he brought to everything. Thomas Runningwaiter was the best handler of horses he had worked with. He would treat the horses well and the customers honestly, and anyone who had a problem with his employment was welcome to take their horses elsewhere. He said this without anger, simply and clearly, because it was true, and because some things needed to be said plainly. Most people accepted it. A few did not, and took their horses to a man named Briggs who had a smaller stable on the far end of town, and whose horses were never quite as well maintained. They generally came back. Thomas Runningwaiter turned out to be not only excellent with horses but mechanically gifted, and over the following year Clayton taught him the basic carpentry and metalwork necessary for maintaining tack and equipment. And Thomas proved to be an exceptional student in the tradition of people who have finally found the thing they were meant to do and pour themselves into it without reservation. The summer of 1887 was the summer that Harlan Creek began, quite unmistakably, to become a real town. A doctor arrived, a young man named Dr. Aurelius Webb, newly graduated, with more book learning than practical experience and the humility to know it, who set up a practice in 2 rooms above the general store, and who proceeded to learn his practical knowledge on the citizens of Harlan Creek, who were by and large forgiving. A newspaper started, a weekly single-sheet affair called the Harlan Creek Courier, edited by a woman named Betsy Marks who had done 3 years of journalism in Kansas, and who had very strong opinions about what constituted news and what constituted gossip, and who kept the distinction clear in her paper, if not always in conversation. In August of that year, Matilda Atwood Finley wrote a letter to the Territorial Board of Education, proposing a formal curriculum structure for the Harlan Creek School, including suggested textbooks, a standard progression through grades, and a proposal for the scholarship program for advanced students that would eventually carry Samuel Ordega to Albuquerque at the age of 13. The letter was detailed, precise, and beautifully argued, and it resulted in a visit from a territorial education officer who spent 2 days in Harlan Creek, observing the school, and who afterward wrote in his report that the Harlan Creek School represented the highest standard of frontier education he had encountered in 15 years of travel. Matilda showed Clayton the report that evening, and he read it carefully and then set it down and said, "This is because of you, all of it. The children are bright and willing," she said, "because you make the work interesting and you see them as capable of it," he said, "which is what this says if you read it carefully." She read it again. He watched her read it, watched the controlled expression on her face that he had come to understand concealed a more private response, and waited. "It is a good report," she said finally, which was her way of allowing herself to feel pleased. "It is an extraordinary report," he said, "about an extraordinary teacher." She looked at him with the expression he loved most, the one that was not quite a smile but contained the warmth of one, the expression she wore when he said something that she found precisely true. "You are biased," she said. "I am," he said. "I'm also right." James turned 2 in March of 1888, and was at this point a determined walker with strong opinions about horses, which he had inherited from prolonged exposure to the livery, and about books, which he had inherited from the shelf of them that lined the sitting-room wall, the ones his mother was always reading, which he was not yet old enough to read himself but treated with the reverence appropriate to sacred objects. He had dark hair like his father and brown eyes like his mother, and a way of looking at things with sustained attention that was entirely his own, and he was, his parents agreed in private, a remarkable small person. In April of 1888, Matilda told Clayton that she was expecting their second child. She had not waited 3 weeks this time. She told him the same evening she was fairly certain, sitting at the kitchen table after James was in bed with the look of a woman delivering welcome news. "March again," he said. "Probably February," she said. "I think perhaps late February." "You've done the calculation," he said. "Approximately," she said. He was across the table and had her hands before she had finished the word, and she laughed the full, unguarded laugh and said, "Clayton, your arithmetic enthusiasm is somewhat alarming." "My arithmetic enthusiasm," he said, "is entirely for you." The second child, a daughter, arrived on a cold February night in 1889, and was delivered by Dr. Webb with rather more confidence and skill than he had possessed when he arrived, which was reassuring to everyone. She was named Clara, which Matilda had chosen from a list of names she had maintained privately since girlhood, and she was a small and serene-looking child who from the beginning demonstrated a patience that seemed improbable for an infant, as if she had arrived in this world and found it broadly satisfactory, and could not understand why anyone would fuss. James, now almost 3, regarded his sister with the cautious diplomatic interest of a small person confronted with a significant change in circumstances, and after a week of careful observation announced, in the solemn way he had of announcing things, that she was acceptable. Matilda recorded this in the family Bible with the same seriousness she gave to everything. James Finley, born March 1886. Clara Finley, born February 1889. And above them, Clayton Finley and Matilda Atwood Finley, and the date of their marriage in March 1885, which was 4 years ago this spring. Clayton stood in the kitchen doorway one evening in the late spring of 1889, watching Matilda nurse Clara at the kitchen table while James sat on the floor nearby with the wooden horse Samuel Ortega had carved, conducting some elaborate and entirely private drama between the horse and a wooden block that had been designated, apparently, as a building. The kitchen smelled of the stew that was on the stove and the particular warm smell of the lamp oil and the dry desert evening coming through the window, and everything in the scene was so completely, specifically right that he had to stop and simply look at it for a moment. The way you stop when you come around a bend in the road, and the landscape opens up into something that requires your full attention. Matilda looked up from Clara and saw him standing there, and understood from his expression whatever it was his expression said. "Come sit down," she said. He crossed the room and sat across from her, and watched his daughter nurse and his son play on the floor, and thought about a young man of 19 who had signed his name on a promissory note with a flourish and lost everything and spent 12 years learning to make himself invisible, writing Clayton Finley in small, tight letters on other men's ledgers as if the name were something to apologize for. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About names," he said. "About writing my name." She tilted her head slightly, watching him. "When I came to Harlan Creek," he said, "the last time I had written my name with any pride in it was at 19, 12 years. It was just a signature after that, something you put on papers when papers require it. I wrote it small, like I was trying not to take up space." She was quiet, listening. "When I wrote our names in the Bible," he said, "James's birth and then Clara's, I wrote them with the same care I give the window frames, making sure each part got its proper space." He paused, and it occurred to me that the difference was you. Not that you changed me, you'd probably say I was doing that myself, and you'd be right about the mechanism, but that you were the reason it was worth doing. You said my name like it belonged to someone, and I could not shake the feeling. "I always thought it did," she said. "Belonged to someone. I know," he said. "That's the thing, you thought it before you had any evidence. I needed the evidence." She moved Clara to her shoulder and patted the baby's back, her eyes on him. "And now," she said, "now I have 4 years of it," he said, "and a livery with my name on the sign, and 2 children in the Bible, and a house I built with my own hands that will be here after I'm gone." He looked at his hands on the table, capable, scarred hands, the kind that bear the marks of work. "I think the name is worth something now." "It was always worth something," she said. "You're only now agreeing with me." "I'm only now agreeing with you," he said. "You are very patient." "I am a teacher," she said. "Patience is occupational." He laughed, and James looked up from his wooden horse and laughed too, for reasons of his own, and Clara, startled by the noise, made a small sound of surprised inquiry, and the kitchen held all of them in its warm, lamplit square of December evening, and everything in Clayton Finley's life was, at that moment, in exactly the right place. The years that followed settled into the rhythms of people who have found their form and are now, with deep contentment, living it. The livery grew with the town. Harlan Creek had nearly 300 residents by 1891, a proper and thriving small community with a school and a doctor and a newspaper, and a growing network of families who had come west for a chance and found something worth staying for. Thomas Runningwaiter became Clayton's full partner in the livery by 1890, which was a development that satisfied Clayton thoroughly, both because Thomas had earned it and because it was the right thing, and because doing right things was, he had long since concluded, the only way to live that allowed you any peace. Eleanor Holt arrived to join the school in 1888, as had been planned, and she and Matilda worked together with the productive harmony of 2 people who share high standards and compatible methods, and the Harlan Creek School became, in the following years, something that Matilda had quietly intended from the beginning, a model of what frontier education could be when taken seriously by someone who knew what education could do. Samuel Ortega went to Albuquerque in 1889, at 13, on the scholarship that Matilda had been building toward since his first day in her classroom. He was frightened and he was determined, and he carried himself with a dignity that made his mother cry at the train station in Dempsey. He wrote to Matilda faithfully, and she wrote back with the same faithfulness, and in the letters she gave him the same thing she gave everyone who came into her professional life: clear thinking, high expectations, and the unshakable conviction that he was capable of meeting them. He met them, and more. By 1895, Samuel Ortega was teaching mathematics at a school in Albuquerque and writing letters that described the work with the same combination of joy and precision that had characterized Matilda's own relationship with teaching. James Finley grew into a boy who loved horses as much as his father and books as much as his mother, which was an inheritance that served him excellently. He learned to ride before he was 4 and to read before he was 5, and he moved through Harlan Creek with the easy confidence of a child who knows he is loved and knows where he belongs. Clara was quieter, more contemplative. She had her mother's patience and her father's tendency to look at things for a long time before deciding what to say about them. And she had, by the time she was 4, a remarkable ability to identify the various birds of the desert Southwest, which she did with the careful precision of someone who has noticed that the world rewards close attention. There was a third child born in 1892, a boy they named Robert, who arrived in the late spring, and who was, from his first breath, loud and curious, and apparently indignant about the volume of interesting things there were to do, and the limited number of hours available to do them. He was, Clayton told Matilda privately, the most demanding and most entertaining child he had ever encountered, and Matilda said that he reminded her of herself at that age, which explained a great deal. The house on the north edge of town had been expanded by then. Clayton had added 2 bedrooms in 1891, properly insulated against the winter, with windows that faced the morning light, and the sitting room wall of bookshelves had been extended twice to accommodate the continuing arrival of books, which Matilda acquired the way some people acquire land, steadily and with clear intention. The garden had improved dramatically once they had accepted Rosa Soto's standing offer to simply come and manage it in exchange for a portion of the harvest, which meant the garden was now productive and beautiful and smelled, in July, like something out of a catalog illustration. In 1893, Clayton built a proper carpentry shop behind the livery, in a space that had been used for storage, because the carpentry work had grown to the point where it needed a dedicated space and proper tools. He outfitted it carefully, acquiring a bench and a proper set of planes and chisels and saws, and he ran the shop alongside the livery, which he could do because Thomas Runningwater ran the day-to-day livery operation with complete reliability and had done so for years. The sign above the shop said simply, "Finley Carpentry." He painted it himself, the same way he had painted the livery sign, each letter given its full space. He stood back from it the morning he hung it and felt the same thing he had felt the first time, looking at his name on a building, the specific satisfaction of a name that means something, that stands for work people can depend on, that occupies its space on the board without apology. Matilda came by the shop that morning, on her way to the school with Clara beside her, Clara, 4 years old and very serious, wearing a small version of her mother's practical expression. They stood together and looked at the sign, the three of them, and Clara said, in the careful tone she brought to important observations, "Our name." "Our name," Clayton agreed. "It's a good name," Clara said, with the finality of a conclusion reached after sufficient consideration. "It is," Matilda said. She looked up at Clayton. "It always was." He put his arm around her there on the street in the morning light in front of the sign with his name on it, with Clara between them and the sound of the livery behind, and the school 2 blocks away and the house with its bookshelves and its 2 cottonwoods a quarter-mile north, and he thought, this is it. This is the thing. The thing that all of those years on the road, all of those fences and cattle drives and other men's roofs, had been moving toward, not in a straight line, not by any kind of design he could have articulated, but with the insistence of water finding its level, this life, this woman, this name on a board in the New Mexico sun. He thought about the promissory note he had signed at 19 with a flourish. He thought about the small, tight letters of his name on 12 years of other men's ledgers. He thought about a woman with a notebook full of careful columns standing in a general store in October, saying Clayton Finley like she was reading a name she had been expecting to encounter. He thought about the Bible, the family record, the names in their clear, careful rows. He thought about the house he had built and the children who slept in it, and the woman who filled it with books and good cooking and the steady warmth of a person who had decided, with her characteristic precision, that this was where she belonged and who she belonged to, and had acted accordingly with complete and unswerving commitment. He thought about what it means to be known. Not famous, not celebrated, not the subject of admiring accounts in newspapers, simply known by a small number of people who have looked carefully and decided that what they see is worth staying for. His children knew him. His neighbors knew him. Emilio and Rosa Soto, who still wrote from Albuquerque and came back to visit, knew him. Thomas Runningwater, who had been given an honest chance when the territory offered very few of them, knew him. And Matilda Atwood Finley knew him, perhaps better than he had ever known himself, in the way that people who love you with their eyes open see the parts of you that you keep in the dark. And she had decided, with the full evidence before her, that Clayton Finley was worth something. That the name deserved its space. That the man it belonged to was, however improbably, exactly the person he was trying to be. He had not been able to shake that feeling. He had stopped trying. He had decided instead to deserve it, every day, with whatever his hands and his word and his presence could offer to be, in the small particular way that a man living a real life can be, the person his name suggested, to fill the letters. On a Saturday morning in the spring of 1895, Clayton and Matilda walked their usual route along the creek, which had by now become something they had done hundreds of times, in all seasons and weathers, with various combinations of children and without, in conversation and in silence. The children were with the Soto cousins, who had come to visit from Albuquerque, and the morning was theirs alone. The creek was running high from the snowmelt, turbulent and clear over the pale stones, and the cottonwoods were putting out their first leaves, that particular luminous yellow-green of early spring that made everything look new. They walked without speaking for a while, comfortably, in the way of people who have been walking beside each other long enough that silence has stopped needing to be explained. 10 years, she said eventually. In October, he said. 10 years since I rode into town. Bought cornmeal and beans, she said, and met you, he said, and met me, she agreed. She walked a few steps, watching the creek. Are you happy, Clayton? He considered this with the seriousness it deserved her seriousness, the kind she had taught him to bring to things that mattered. Not a reflex answer, not the automatic fine of a man who has been trained by solitude to keep his interior life private, but an honest answer, arrived at through actual attention. Yes, he said, I am happy. I am more happy than I knew was possible for me when I rode in, and considerably more than I thought I deserved. And I have been aware, for most of the past 10 years, that the happiness is yours. Not a gift you gave me once, but something you give me continuously, by being who you are and by being here. She was quiet for a moment, watching the creek, and he could see that she was feeling the weight of this and allowing herself to feel it, which was something she had gotten better at over the years, receiving care the way she gave it, fully and without deflection. I'm happy too, she said, more than I expected. I came west with a plan, and the plan was good, but it was narrow, a school, a job, a purpose. I did not expect, she paused, finding the precise word, abundance, the way this has been abundant. He took her hand, the way he had taken it 10 years ago on the creek bank, and she interlaced her fingers with his, and they walked along the water in the spring morning, and Harlan Creek lay behind them with its several hundred lives and its school full of children and its newspaper and its doctor and its livery, and the carpentry shop with his name on it and the house with the bookshelves. And before them, The creek went on through the valley toward the distant ridges. And the morning was clear, and the sky was the deep, unqualified blue of the high desert, and everything was exactly as it should be. They walked all the way to the place where the creek bent around the big cottonwood, the one they had discovered in their first winter together, and they stopped there and stood listening to the water, and the sunlight came through the new leaves and made shifting patterns on the surface of the creek, and Clayton Finley thought, "I know who I am. I know where I am. I know what my name is worth." He had learned all of this here in this place, with this woman, who had said his name like it meant something before he had given her a single reason, and had spent 10 years patiently and thoroughly showing him that she had been right. It was a fine spring morning in the territory, and the creek was running clear, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had come a very long way to get there, and every mile of it had been worth it.